Hey, welcome back to the channel. Today's journey is going to blow your mind because we're uncovering the hidden treasures, hiding in plain sight. Tiny Australian threepence coins that could be worth more than a brand new car, even more than a house. Stay with me, because in just a few minutes, you'll see how something so small can hold a story, a legacy, and a fortune. Let's moving on. First up, the 1947 Australian threepence. The year 1947 in Australia was a period of transition, recovery and resilience. World War II had ended just 2 years earlier, and the nation was finding its place in a changing global order. Life was beginning to settle, industry was expanding, and society was rebuilding. In this environment, coins like the Australian threepence were not just pieces of silver. They were daily essentials, tokens of survival, trade, and progress. The 1947 Australian threepence was struck at the Melbourne Mint, a facility with a long and prestigious history of producing coins for the Commonwealth. Like its predecessors, it was minted in a silver alloy, 50% silver, balanced with copper and other metals to give it strength. At the time, silver content gave even small coins, like the threepence, intrinsic value, which added to their desirability. Its design was simple yet meaningful. The obverse features the portrait of King George VI, designed by Thomas Humphrey Paget. His image carried a sense of strength, dignity, and calm, traits that were vital during the wartime years when he served as the symbolic head of the Commonwealth. On the reverse, George Kruger Gray's design of 2 crossed wheat stalks stood for prosperity, growth, and the agricultural backbone of Australia. Above the wheat stalks is the crown, symbolizing loyalty to the monarchy, while the year of minting and the word threepence frame the bottom half. At first glance, the 1947 threepence might seem like an ordinary small coin from the post-war period. After all, millions were minted. But here's where rarity steps in. While plenty were struck, the majority entered circulation almost immediately. Coins were scarce in the late 1940s due to heavy economic activity, and these tiny silver pieces were used relentlessly in everyday transactions, buying bread, newspapers, or a tram ticket. Over time, the delicate surfaces wore down, and the luster faded. This relentless circulation means that finding an uncirculated example, one that has never been used, with crisp details and glowing silver brilliance, is extremely rare today. Numismatists prize these coins for one simple reason: condition rarity. The vast majority of surviving 1947 threepences show scratches, dullness, and flattening from decades of use. But those very few that escaped wear, perhaps stored in a collection or set aside as a keepsake, now command extraordinary premiums in the collector's market. In top mint state grades, these coins can sell for as much as $35,000, a jaw-dropping figure for what was once worth only 3 pennies. The coin's value also reflects its role in Australia's history. It is not just silver, it is a symbol of the resilience of a nation rebuilding after war. Holding a pristine 1947 threepence is like holding a time capsule of that era. It reminds us of an Australia that was transitioning into prosperity, a nation that would grow rapidly in the following decades. Collectors don't just buy the coin. They buy the story behind it, the struggle, the survival, and the chance discovery of such a rarity in exceptional condition. When a high-grade example comes up at auction, bidding wars often erupt. Collectors know they're not just chasing a coin, but a piece of post-war Australia. The allure of the 1947 threepence lies in its blend of historical depth, design beauty, scarcity, and top condition, and the powerful narrative it carries. That is why today, the 1947 Australian threepence stands tall in the numismatic world, with market values soaring as high as $35,000. Next up, the 1944 Australian threepence. Now we move a few years back in time, into the thick of World War II. The year is 1944. Australia is a nation deeply involved in the war effort. Men are overseas fighting, women are working in factories, and the entire economy is focused on supporting the Allied cause. resources are stretched thin, and this strain extends even to something as small and seemingly insignificant as coinage. The Australian government faced a challenge. The demand for coins, particularly small denominations like the threepence, was skyrocketing due to wartime commerce, rationing systems, and day-to-day trade. The local mints alone could not keep up with this demand, so Australia turned to its wartime ally, the United States. As a result, in 1944, a significant portion of Australian threepences were struck at the San Francisco Mint in California. These coins bear the tiny but incredibly significant S mint mark, located on the reverse near the date. At first glance, it might be easy to miss, but that S tells a remarkable story. It signifies that this Australian coin was minted thousands of miles away, in another country, under extraordinary circumstances. The San Francisco Mint, already busy striking American coinage, dedicated part of its production to help Australia maintain its currency supply. This act of cooperation highlights the solidarity of the Allied nations during the war, a practical and symbolic gesture of unity. The design of the 1944 threepence is identical to other years. The obverse bears the image of King George VI, representing strength and continuity during turbulent times, while the reverse features Kruger Gray's wheat stalks. But what sets the 1944 issue apart is its origin, and the fact that, once released into circulation, it was used heavily across Australia. Soldiers returning home, families buying rationed goods, and workers in bustling wartime industries all handled these coins. Very few were spared from circulation, and over time, the silver lost its shine. The designs wore down, and countless examples disappeared altogether. For collectors, the challenge lies in finding an example in superb, untouched condition. Most 1944 threepences are common in lower grades, but in mint state, especially those struck in San Francisco, they are incredibly scarce. The combination of wartime production, heavy circulation, and limited preservation means that high-grade survivors are genuine rarities. This is why, when a pristine 1944 Australian threepence surfaces at auction, it commands astonishing prices. Collectors are willing to pay tens of thousands because the coin represents so much more than metal. It represents sacrifice, international cooperation, and a snapshot of Australia during one of the most critical periods of its history. The S mint mark gives it a unique place in numismatics, linking it directly to the United States and the shared struggles of the Allies. In today's market, exceptional examples of the 1944 Australian threepence have been valued as high as $47,000. That figure reflects not only its rarity in top grade but also its immense historical significance. To hold one is to hold a piece of World War II history, a small but powerful reminder of how even coins were part of the global war effort. The 1944 threepence, therefore, is far more than a collectible. It is a wartime artifact. It tells the story of a world at war, of nations supporting one another, and of ordinary people whose lives were touched daily by this humble piece of silver. Today, it stands as one of Australia's most treasured numismatic rarities, a coin whose small size belies its massive significance and value. Next up, the 1941 Australian threepence. The year 1941 marked a turning point in world history. The Second World War was raging, and Australia found itself deeply involved, both militarily and economically. Coins from this era, especially small silver pieces like the threepence, were a vital part of everyday life. Yet hidden within the millions of coins produced lies a rarity that today can be worth as much as $43,000, the 1941 Australian threepence. To understand why this coin is so significant, we must first look at the time in which it was struck. In 1941, Australia was experiencing immense strain. The war effort consumed nearly every aspect of daily life. Factories that once produced consumer goods were now manufacturing equipment and supplies for the war. Rationing was in place, and every household felt the effects of shortages. Despite these challenges, coinage had to keep flowing, because commerce could not stop. Small denominations like the threepence were particularly crucial. as they were used in day-to-day transactions for food, transportation, and basic goods. The Melbourne Mint produced the 1941 Australian Threepence, continuing with the 50% silver alloy, standard that had been in place since 1940. On the obverse is the portrait of King George VI, designed by Thomas Humphrey Paget. His image conveyed dignity and reassurance, qualities desperately needed at a time when the Commonwealth faced uncertainty. The reverse features George Kruger Gray's iconic crossed wheat stalks design. The wheat symbolized Australia's agricultural strength, a reminder of prosperity and growth, even in the darkest years of the war. But why does this coin, which had a large mintage, command such staggering values today? The answer lies in condition rarity. Most 1941 threepences were released into circulation almost immediately, passing through countless hands, across shop counters, and into the pockets of ordinary Australians. They endured years of use during the war and beyond, which means that today, most surviving examples show heavy wear. Their surfaces are dulled, their details flattened, and their luster long gone. What sets apart the 1941 issue is how exceedingly difficult it is to find in pristine condition. Mint state examples, untouched by circulation, are incredibly scarce. Those with brilliant silver luster, sharp details, and virtually no marks are considered trophy pieces among collectors. It is this scarcity of high-grade survivors that pushes values into the tens of thousands. When a top-quality 1941 threepence appears at auction, collectors know they are bidding not just for a coin, but for a piece of wartime Australia. It is a tangible link to a moment when the nation was under extraordinary pressure, yet life and commerce carried on. Owning a gem-quality specimen is like holding a preserved piece of 1941 itself, a year that tested Australia's resilience and unity. In recent years, some of these coins in the highest grades have reached market values of $43,000. That is an astonishing sum for a coin that was once worth 3 pennies. A reminder of how history, rarity, and preservation can transform something so ordinary into something truly extraordinary. The 1941 Australian Threepence is not just silver. It is a story of war, survival, and rarity, and that is why it continues to command the attention and the wallets of serious collectors worldwide. Next up, the 1948 Australian Threepence. As Australia moved into the post-war years, the nation was in the process of rebuilding, modernizing, and reshaping its identity. The war was over, soldiers had returned home, and a new era of prosperity was beginning. Against this backdrop came the 1948 Australian Threepence, a small silver coin that today holds a surprisingly large place in the numismatic world, with values soaring up to $40,000 in the highest grades. The 1948 issue was minted at the Melbourne Mint, continuing the tradition of striking threepences in 50% silver. Though it was produced in large numbers to meet the needs of a growing economy, what makes the 1948 threepence remarkable is the scarcity of coins that have survived in pristine condition. By this time, inflation and increasing economic activity meant that small change was heavily used. Coins like the threepence passed quickly from hand to hand in shops, markets, and everyday life, and they often endured years of circulation before being withdrawn. The obverse of the coin features the portrait of King George VI by Humphrey Paget, still the reigning monarch who had led the Commonwealth through the war years. His dignified portrait symbolized continuity and stability, qualities much appreciated in the uncertain years following global conflict. The reverse retained Kruger Gray's wheat design, a symbol that had become synonymous with resilience and prosperity for Australia. What collectors treasure about the 1948 issue is not rarity in mintage, but rarity in preservation. Most examples were circulated until they were worn smooth, meaning high-grade survivors are virtually non-existent. The few that were saved, perhaps set aside in collections, mint sets or by chance, are now worth small fortunes. The charm of the 1948 threepence also lies in its historical significance. It represents the dawn of post-war Australia, a time when the nation was entering a period of growth, modernization, and cultural change. For collectors, Owning a mint state specimen is like owning a silver snapshot of that moment in history, a symbol of hope and renewal after years of struggle. At auction, top grade 1948, Australian threepences have brought prices up to $40,000. That astonishing figure reflects not only the difficulty of finding one in perfect condition, but also the deep desire among collectors to own such an elusive piece. It is not just about the coin itself, but about what it represents: survival, preservation, and the incredible rarity of perfection. The 1948 Australian threepence is more than a piece of silver. It is a historical artifact, a symbol of Australia's post-war journey, and a collector's prize. From its humble beginnings as small change in people's pockets to its transformation into a five-figure rarity, this coin proves that even the smallest denominations can carry immense value, both financially and historically. Next up, the 1942 Australian threepence. The year 1942 was one of the most critical moments in Australia's history. World War II was at its peak, and for the first time, the Australian mainland faced direct threats. Japanese forces had entered the Pacific, and in February of that year, Darwin suffered devastating air raids. The war felt closer than ever, and life in Australia was filled with fear, sacrifice, and resilience. Against this turbulent backdrop, the Australian threepence of 1942 was struck, a small coin that today has become a highly prized numismatic treasure, reaching values as high as $55,000 in the rarest mint state condition. The 1942 threepence holds a particularly fascinating story because it was struck in two different locations: the Melbourne Mint in Australia and the San Francisco Mint in the United States. To meet the overwhelming demand for currency during wartime, Australia relied on its American allies for assistance. This led to the creation of the 1942 S threepence, identifiable by the small S mint mark near the date on the reverse. These San Francisco issues are especially significant, as they are tangible symbols of Allied cooperation during one of the darkest periods of the 20th century. The coin's design remained consistent with previous years. The obverse features King George VI, whose reign symbolized strength and stability in a world consumed by war. His portrait, designed by Thomas Humphrey Paget, projected dignity and calm authority. The reverse showcases George Kruger Gray's iconic crossed wheat stalks design, a symbol that resonated deeply during wartime, representing food security, agricultural strength, and hope for a prosperous future. Despite being minted in relatively large numbers, the 1942 threepence quickly disappeared into circulation. Money was in constant demand, and coins like the threepence were indispensable in daily life, whether paying for rationed supplies, public transportation, or small transactions that kept communities functioning during wartime scarcity. As a result, most 1942 threepences endured heavy wear. Their surfaces dulled, their details flattened, and few were ever preserved in pristine, untouched condition. This is what makes high-grade 1942 examples so incredibly rare today. Collectors search for those elusive coins that escaped circulation, coins that still shine with their original silver brilliance, with razor-sharp details and virtually no signs of handling. These few survivors are the jewels of Australian numismatics. When one appears at auction, it sparks intense competition among collectors. The value of $55,000 is not just a reflection of silver, content, or design. It represents the extreme rarity of condition, the historical significance of wartime minting, and the emotional weight of owning a coin from one of the most dangerous years in Australian history. The 1942 Australian threepence is more than a collectible. It is a wartime artifact, a token of international cooperation, and a silver witness to the struggles and resilience of a nation under threat. Next up, the 1943 Australian threepence. If 1942 was a year of fear and struggle, 1943 was a year of determination and endurance. Australia was fully mobilized for the war effort. Troops were fighting in the Pacific. Industries were running around the clock, and rationing continued to shape daily life. Amid this, the Australian threepence of 1943 was struck, another small silver coin that carried immense significance in its time and has since become one of the great rarities in Australian coinage, with values soaring up to $64,000 in top condition. Like the 1942 issue, the 1943 threepence was produced both in Melbourne and at the San Francisco Mint in the United States. Again, the S mint mark identifies those struck overseas. The decision to mint Australian coins abroad was driven by necessity. The demands of war stretched resources thin, and international cooperation was the only way to ensure that enough coins reached circulation. These overseas minted coins are direct reminders of how even small denominations were shaped by the global conflict. The design of the 1943 threepence continued the familiar motifs. On the obverse, King George VI's portrait represented the stability of the monarchy and unity across the Commonwealth. His image reassured citizens of a sense of continuity, even in turbulent times. On the reverse, Kruger-Gray's crossed wheat stalks provided not only aesthetic beauty but also a message of resilience and survival. Agriculture was vital during wartime, as food security meant survival for both civilians and troops. The wheat symbol carried a meaning deeper than design. It was a reminder of Australia's strength and self-reliance. The majority of 1943 threepences went straight into circulation and stayed there for decades. These coins were used endlessly in everyday life, buying bread, milk, or rationed goods, passing through countless hands in a country still under wartime restrictions. By the time they were withdrawn from circulation, most were heavily worn, their original luster gone. This is why finding an uncirculated 1943 threepence today is such a rarity. The vast majority of examples are in low to medium grades, but those few that survived untouched are the treasures collectors dream of. In gem mint state, they show dazzling silver brilliance, crisp details and flawless fields. These are the coins that command staggering sums when they appear at auction, reaching market values as high as $64,000. The 1943 Australian threepence is a true giant in the world of Australian numismatics. Its value reflects not only its scarcity in high grade, but also its wartime story. Each coin represents a piece of history, an era when Australia was tested as never before, when global cooperation was essential, and when even the smallest coin carried enormous meaning. To own a mint state 1943 threepence is to own a symbol of resilience. It is not simply a piece of silver. It is a coin that speaks of soldiers abroad, families at home, and a nation enduring hardship with courage. That is why collectors chase this rarity with such passion, driving its value into the tens of thousands and ensuring its place as one of the most sought-after Australian coins of the 20th century. Next up, 1940 Australian threepence. The year 1940 was one of the most uncertain in Australia's history. The Second World War had begun the year before, and Australia was already deeply committed to the Allied cause. Troops were being deployed overseas, industries were reorganized for war, and the home front was beginning to feel the strains of rationing and shortages. In this climate, even the smallest pieces of silver coinage, like the Australian threepence, carried immense importance. The 1940 Australian threepence was struck at the Melbourne Mint and holds a particularly fascinating place in numismatic history. It was the first year in which the silver content of Australia's coinage was reduced. Prior to 1940, threepences were struck in sterling silver, 92.5% pure. But with the demands of war weighing heavily on resources, the government lowered the fineness to 50% silver, alloyed with copper and nickel. This decision not only conserved precious silver for the war effort, but also marked a major turning point in Australian coinage. For collectors today, the 1940 threepence represents both a historical and technical milestone. The obverse of the coin features the portrait of King George VI, designed by Thomas Humphrey Paget. It is a dignified and reassuring likeness of the monarch who, at that very moment, was serving as the symbolic head of a commonwealth fighting for survival. The reverse design, by George Kruger-Gray, depicts two crossed wheat stalks beneath a crown. This design carried a powerful symbolism. Wheat was the foundation of Australia's agricultural strength, while the crown above reinforced the nation's loyalty to the monarchy. Millions of these coins were produced. But here's where rarity comes into play. Very few have survived in high-grade condition. The vast majority of 1940 threepences entered circulation immediately and were used heavily during wartime. Coins were passed from hand to hand across shop counters, exchanged on trams, or used in rationing systems. By the time they were withdrawn from circulation decades later, most examples were worn, scratched, and stripped of their original brilliance. Uncirculated examples, however, are exceedingly scarce. Those that somehow avoided circulation, perhaps tucked away in a collection or kept as part of a mint roll, now rank among the most sought-after Australian coins. In gem mint state, the 1940 threepence displays beautiful luster, crisp details in the king's portrait, and sharp definition in the wheat stalks. These specimens are breathtaking to behold and nearly impossible to find. This is why the 1940 Australian threepence has achieved market values as high as $50,000. Collectors understand that its importance extends far beyond silver and design. It is a coin that tells the story of wartime Australia, of resource shortages, of changes in minting standards, and of a nation stepping fully into the challenges of global conflict. For numismatists, owning a top-quality 1940 threepence is like owning a silver time capsule from one of the most defining years of the 20th century. When a pristine 1940 threepence comes to auction, it commands fierce competition. Its blend of historical significance, scarcity in high grades, and beauty makes it a crown jewel for collectors. That is why this tiny coin, once worth 3 pennies, can now be worth as much as $50,000. Next up, 1938 Australian Threepence. The story of the 1938 Australian Threepence begins not just with silver and minting, but with history, politics, and change. This was the very first year that King George VI appeared on Australian coinage, following the abdication crisis of his brother, Edward VIII in 1936. By 1938, the new monarch was firmly on the throne, and Australia's coins were redesigned to carry his image. For collectors, the 1938 threepence marks the start of a new era, and it is one of the greatest rarities in the entire Australian coin series, with values reaching up to an astounding $100,000. The coin was struck at the Melbourne Mint and was produced in sterling silver, 92.5% pure. This makes it one of the last Australian threepences struck in high-fineness silver, before the reduction in 1940. The obverse, designed by Thomas Humphrey Paget, features the first effigy of King George VI, a youthful, stately portrait that symbolized stability at a time when the monarchy itself had recently been shaken. The reverse, by George Kruger Gray, introduced the now famous crossed wheat design. For 1938, this was the debut of a motif that would remain on the threepence until decimalization in 1966. But why is the 1938 threepence so rare? The answer lies in mintage and survival. Relatively few were struck compared to later years, and the majority went straight into circulation. These coins were heavily used during the late 1930s and early 1940s, as Australia was still recovering from the Great Depression and heading into the uncertainty of war. People needed their coins, and few thought of saving them in pristine condition. As a result, most surviving 1938 threepences today are worn, dull, and far from mint state. High-grade examples are virtually non-existent. Only a small handful of coins have been discovered in superb, uncirculated condition, and these are the pieces that drive the coin's legendary status among collectors. A gem-quality 1938 threepence is a breathtaking sight. Sharp, crisp details in the king's portrait, flawless luster shimmering across the silver surface, and perfect definition in the delicate wheat stalks. Such coins are the holy grail of Australian numismatics. At auction, when one of these elusive gems appears, the bidding is intense. Collectors know that opportunities to acquire a top-grade 1938 threepence come perhaps once in a lifetime. Prices have soared to as high as $100,000, making this small coin one of the most valuable minor denominations in all of Australian history. But its value is not just about rarity, it is about symbolism. The 1938 threepence represents the beginning of the reign of George VI, the debut of an iconic design, and the final years of sterling silver in Australian coinage. It embodies change, resilience, and the unfolding story of a nation on the brink of war. For collectors, the 1938 Australian threepence is more than a numismatic rarity. It is a coin of transition, a piece of history, and one of the most prized treasures ever struck by the Melbourne Mint, with values reaching into six figures. It stands as proof that even the smallest coin can carry the weight of immense historical and monetary significance. Next up, the 1949 Australian threepence is one of those coins that continues to fascinate numismatists due to its surprising scarcity and pristine condition, and the unique circumstances of its production. By 1949, Australia was still recovering from the economic and industrial upheavals of World War II, and the Royal Australian Mint was striking coins to meet the nation's needs while also phasing out wartime emergency minting arrangements. This particular year stands out because the threepence denomination was beginning to see less and less use in everyday transactions. Inflation and shifting economic habits meant people relied more on higher denominations, and as a result, the small silver coins often slipped through circulation unnoticed, worn down, and eventually withdrawn. The 1949 issue was produced in relatively modest numbers compared to earlier years, and while millions may have been struck, the reality is that very few have survived in the highest states of preservation. Those that did remain in uncirculated or near-perfect mint state condition are today regarded as treasures of Australian coinage. Collectors prize these examples not just for their rarity, but for their aesthetic beauty. The obverse bears the refined portrait of King George VI, while the reverse carries George Kruger Gray's enduring wheat sheaf design, representing agricultural abundance and national prosperity. Over the decades, the 1949's threepence has gained a reputation as one of the standout post-war rarities, with high-grade specimens reaching astonishing values in auctions and private sales. Today, a top-quality example can command market values as high as $120,000. The remarkable figure is a reflection of the coin's scarcity, its historical importance as one of the last silver threepences before Australia shifted toward newer metals, and the deep passion of collectors who seek to complete their George VI series. Owning a pristine 1949 Australian threepence is more than an investment. It is a piece of history that links post-war Australia to the broader story of changing currency and society. For many, it is a reminder of a transitional period when the world was shifting toward modernity. Yet coins still carried the weight of tradition, artistry, and value far beyond their face denomination. Next up, the 1939 Australian threepence is, without question, one of the most celebrated and valuable small silver coins ever minted in Australia, with a legacy that places it at the very peak of numismatic desirability. Its story begins in a year of significant transition, both for Australia and the wider world. In 1939, King George VI was firmly established on the throne following the abdication of his brother, Edward VIII, and Australia itself was navigating the economic uncertainties of the pre-war period. But in terms of coinage, what makes 1939 extraordinary is the design. This was the final year the threepence bore the older, reverse design of 3 ears of wheat tied together, a motif introduced in 1938 but destined to be changed almost immediately after. The 1939 issue became known to collectors as a one-year type because it represents the brief lifespan of this particular design before George Kruger Gray's crossed wheat sheaves became the permanent standard. The rarity of the coin is heightened by the limited mintage. Only around 3 million were produced, a fraction compared to later issues. Most of these coins entered circulation and were heavily used in daily transactions, resulting in worn and damaged examples. To find one in high mint state condition today is exceptionally rare. Numismatists regard such specimens as masterpieces, combining scarcity, historical importance, and artistic distinction. Beyond its beauty, the coin is wrapped in historical weight. It was struck in the same year that World War II began, making it not just a monetary artifact, but also a relic of a world about to undergo profound upheaval. The obverse of the coin carries the portrait of King George VI, finely detailed and dignified, while the reverse with the distinctive wheat design marks it as unique in the entire series. The combination of being a one-year type, a low mintage, and a wartime issue has driven its desirability to extraordinary heights. Today, a top-grade example of the 1939 Australian Threepence can fetch market values of around $250,000, a staggering figure for a coin with such a small face value. Collectors around the world vie for the opportunity to own one, and when such examples appear at auction, they often spark bidding wars among serious numismatists and investors. To hold a 1939 threepence in pristine condition is to hold not just a rare coin but a piece of art, a fragment of history, and a symbol of both Australia's economic journey and the broader context of a world on the brink of war. Its place as one of the crown jewels of Australian numismatics is secure, and its allure only continues to grow with each passing generation.